From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. The soundtrack of the summer in LA. Despite mass arrests, the controversial deployment of the Marines and the National Guard, and a curfew being imposed, the protests against immigration raids continue.
Walked down to the federal immigration detention complex where supposedly some undocumented migrant workers are being held, and there was a showdown between the protesters and the demonstrators.
There are waves of law enforcement inside the federal building trying to protect this place.
People hurling abuse, the crowd was shouting shame, calling police pigs.
After hours of standing off, this situation has now rapidly deteriorated. The LAPD moving in on horseback, firing rubber bullets at protesters, moving them on through the heart of LA.
You just shut the You okay?
I'm good.
Are you okay?
What began as a protest against immigration raids has now morphed into a battle over the constitutional powers of the president.
And we're calling for the President of the United States to rescind his order so that he can clean up his own mess.
Cars burning all over the place, people rioting. And by the way, we stopped it. If we didn't do the job, that place would be burning down just like the house.
But is it backfiring? By placing a spotlight on the Democrat governor of California, Gavin Newsom, a man who's fast becoming Trump's greatest foe.
Donald Trump is inflaming these conditions. They're trying to incite violence. They're trying to impose the kind of rhetoric that only makes conditions worse, that quite literally put people's lives at risk. And they're intentionally and knowingly doing that.
I don't want a civil war. A civil war would happen if you left it to people like him. He's grossly incompetent. If we didn't bring the guard in, and we would bring more in if we needed it, because we have to make sure there's going to be law and order.
With genuine talk of a potential civil war breaking out, the stakes couldn't be higher. So who will win this political battle? The story today, the governors stand, Newsom, Trump, and the battle for LA.
George, would you mind just reintroducing yourself to our listeners with your new gig?
Hi, my name is George Grylls, and I am Washington Correspondent for The Times.
George, it's been an extraordinary week or so. Just give us a sense of where things are now in California.
So there's now been a curfew in place, which seems to have sort of quietened a little bit some of the worst violence that we saw perhaps over the weekend. But this was all triggered, obviously, by these raids on illegal migrants that Donald Trump had launched. And it was basically an election promise from him. And that's what led to the initial clashes. And then it amped up, obviously, when he started deploying the military.
Well, take us back to those initial clashes. I mean, what exactly was the trigger? How did all of this kick off?
So like everything in the US, it comes down to politics, really. Trump was a bit embarrassed, to be honest, because the deportation figures for the year so far actually tended to show that he was doing worse than Biden. So they were not deporting as many illegal migrants as Biden. So in the past few weeks, you saw this crackdown and a kind of a more aggressive approach where they were targeting workplaces across the US where they suspected kind of groups of illegal migrants of being. And they basically kind of went in heavy-handed, rounded up people. In LA, this was particularly incendiary because they went to the kind of garment district. They also seemed to have started outside a Home Depot where people were kind of looking for cash-in-hand jobs, you know. I mean, they're mostly Hispanic workers from Central America and Mexico. And in a neighborhood that was predominantly Hispanic, these federal immigration officials coming in and rounding up people led to protests, and quite quickly the situation spiraled.
And just give us a sense of the context in California, why this would play out so badly. Give us a sense of it being a sanctuary city and just the role of migration in California.
So California, I mean, the wealthiest state in the US, an absolute superpower. It also has the highest number of illegal migrants in the US, 1.8 million, and around half of those, just over half of those, are in Los Angeles. So for Trump to have a showdown with such big, important state and a democratic state, the optics are really, really good for him as he sees it. He thinks he can kind of corner the Democrats and make them seem like these liberal-minded folk from cities far, far away from the ordinary concerns of middle Americans, and that they're in favor of these protests, which he thinks is a really helpful dynamic. But then there's also the fact that Los Angeles, also San Francisco, have enjoyed this sanctuary status. And in fact, the mayor of Los Angeles kind of reiterated it after Trump's election. And what that means is they try not to comply with requests from the federal government, so from Washington, D.C., for information about migrants. You know, local police aren't going to kind of willingly go and do the work of federal officers.
And just explain where that comes from, because I think sort of for listeners anywhere outside of America, that will sound very odd. This is the local government effectively deciding it won't really cooperate with national government.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to, it's the United States of America. There's a state government and then there's the federal government. And some particularly democratic states tend not to want to take such a kind of hardline immigration policy as perhaps on a federal level. So that's what leads to that kind of antagonism. For the Republicans and Trump in particular, it's a helpful battle to have, isn't it? You have this famously liberal part of the US, which, to be honest, is rarely electorally important because it's always going to vote Democrat. And he can kind of cast the Democrats in a certain light as being this sanctuary city and kind of defending protesters. And you've seen the images of people waving Mexican flags on burnt out cars. For someone who wants to campaign on a law and order issue, they're betting that, well, this is not going to play well in middle America, and that voters in much more electorally contentious parts of the country are going to kind of react to those images quite strongly.
Now, we've been speaking to our reporter Sam Lovett in LA, and he described some of the things he'd witnessed this week.
Sunday night, you could smell tear gas in the air. There was live bangs, live flashes going off constantly. I stupidly parked my car in between the front line of the police and the protesters, and then within a couple of minutes, the police actually started marching forward. A few of them were on horseback. They started releasing more tear gas, and everyone had to really run. I had to race to my car and drive further down the street. The next day, there was a big gathering. We walked down to the federal immigration detention complex where supposedly some undocumented migrant workers are being held. And there was a showdown between the protesters and the demonstrators. People hurling abuse, the crowd was shouting shame, calling police pigs. All of a sudden, a Donald Trump supporter wearing a MAGA cap actually turned up. His hat was stolen. He demanded it back. He ended up getting punched. And then there was this real energy in the crowd. People started chasing him down the street, and there must have been several hundred people going after this one man. It eventually ended up with him being cornered at the entrance of an underground car park, and people were actually throwing objects at him whilst some of the other protesters were around him, telling everyone to remain peaceful. And then the police came and he was removed. There was a 39-year-old woman from Pasadena. She was standing and shouting at the police. She was on the verge of tears at one point. Her voice was very hoarse. She must have been speaking for about 10 minutes. She was getting herself really upset, talking about how families were being torn apart, how children and parents were being detained in holding cells with limited access to water and food. We've heard those reports. We can't substantiate them ourselves. But it felt like at the heart of her concern was human experience, what a lot of these undocumented migrants have been going through. Then I sort of pulled her to the side afterwards. She told me that she'd been tear gassed at least 4 times. She said that she'd been there every day and that she intended to be there until the administration kind of steps back in its enforcement of its immigration crackdown. So I think that really encapsulates the movement. You've got those who are there for genuine, peaceful reasons. They want to protest what's going on here in the city. And then you've got those who are causing trouble, looking for a fight. They relish the confrontation.
On Monday, President Trump ordered US Marines and 2,000 more National Guard troops into LA. Just explain what on earth is going on. How have you got a situation where the president is ordering troops onto the streets of LA?
So from the president's perspective, he has condemned an invasion, as he calls it, never one to shy away from bombastic rhetoric. But he said that it's such an emergency that we actually need to deploy US soldiers on the streets. That's completely the opposite message that Gavin Newsom is saying. He's the governor of California. He's saying this only kind of inflames tensions. It makes things worse. And I mean, it's a pretty severe step. And in fact, you have to go back to 1965 for the last time a president has overruled the governor and said, we're sending in guardsmen. And then the idea of sending in Marines is just ramping it up another level, because the Marines are kind of the elite of the US military. They're a kind of expeditionary force, did a lot of the early brunt of the fighting during Iraq and Afghanistan, led the Pacific Campaign in World War II. So they have a notoriety, they have a stature within the American military. So the idea of sending such an elite force onto the streets of America's second largest city is pretty extraordinary.
And this isn't the first time that Donald Trump has resorted to sending out the National Guard onto the streets. I mean, this is something that began in his last presidency.
I think he threatened to, certainly in the aftermath of the George Floyd death in Minneapolis. That obviously led to a wave of unrest across the US, and Trump certainly talked about invoking the insurrection, which is a piece of legislation that would give him sweeping powers. And he didn't in the end.
We have laws. We have to go by the laws. We can't move in the National Guard. I can call insurrection, but there's no reason to ever do that. We can't call in the National Guard unless we're requested by a governor.
I guess that's the difference, because the National Guard were called in during the Black Lives Matter protests back in 2020, but with the approval of the governors in each state where they were being deployed. That definitely isn't the case here.
Gavin Newsom, who you mentioned earlier, has spoken about this, and he sort of said that the idea of sending troops onto the streets is a threat to democracy itself. And he sort of said this with tears in his eyes.
Look, this isn't just about protests here in Los Angeles. When Donald Trump sought blanket authority to commandeer the National Guard, he made that order apply to every state in this nation. California may be first, but it clearly will not end here. Other states are next. Democracy is next. Democracy is under assault before our eyes. This moment we have feared has arrived. He's taking a wrecking ball to our founding fathers' historic project.
Always a good performer. Why is it constitutionally such a big deal in America?
I think the fact that a president is kind of willingly overruling a state is always, go back to the Civil War. That kind of tension goes right back through American history between how much jurisdiction a state has and how much the federal government has. People talk about Donald Trump having a good war out of this, but I think Gavin Newsom has had a very good war as well. And he has been catapulted, I would say, to the front of the Democratic race to be their candidate in 2028. And bear in mind, he's due to kind of end his governorship of California next year. He's barred from serving any other time. And he has not just the 2028 election itself in mind, he's got to appeal to the base of Democratic voters. And so this kind of slightly dewy-eyed speech where he's speaking in front of the US flag and the Californian flag and talking about the threat to democracy posed by Trump, this is pretty good messaging for the Democratic base, and he's been absolutely everywhere this week in the US.
This is about authoritarian tendencies. This is about command and control. This is about power. This is about ego. My way or the highway. This is a consistent pattern of practice, of recklessness. This guy has abandoned the core principles of this great democracy.
George, one of the reasons this all seems to have ratcheted up so much and become such a huge battle of wills, really, is because, as you say, both the governor, Gavin Newsom, and Donald Trump will be thinking about how it plays to their base, how it plays to their supporters, but also because their relationship has some history. Take us back a step. Remind us a bit about Gavin Newsom, who he is, and a bit of his political background.
So Gavin Newsom kind of came to national prominence when he was mayor of San Francisco. He was a businessman previously. He owns vineyards in Napa Valley. He's quite a suave guy. When he was mayor, he decided that he would issue marriage licenses for gay marriages, even though it was against state law at the time, and became a hero for standing up. Obviously, San Francisco has a long history of advancing gay rights. That was his first kind of debut into the national debates. He has kind of thrived of this antagonism. I mean, Trump, in a sign of how Trump considers him, has given him a nickname. He calls him Gavin Newsom.
A little train going from San Francisco to Los Angeles that's being run by Gavin Newsom, the governor of California. Did you ever hear of Gavin Newsom?
So if you think back to Crooked Hillary, when Hillary Clinton was his rival, or Sleepy Joe, that gives you a sense of how Trump is starting to kind of think about him as a political rival, and has been doing for a while, because they've clashed on other issues. For example, they've clashed on the border and migration previously, but most recently on the wildfires. And that was a time when basically Trump kind of accused the water management policies in California of contributing to the wildfires, and he kind of ridiculed Gavin Newsom for protecting this endangered species of fish.
You have a governor who let the city burn down, didn't want water to be sent down to him. I sent billions of gallons of water. I wanted to do it in the first term. He wouldn't do it over, I don't know, they have environmental reasons, but there were no environmental reasons.
Newsom has always seemed like he could be a contender for the Democrats, but he was maybe seen as too moderate, too centrist. So, for example, he came out against transgender people taking part in women's sports, which was seen as pretty inflammatory and not in line with their core values. So now this crisis where he's come out on one side of the culture wars debate, but then also he has stood up to Trump over putting troops on the streets of major American cities. He's seen his opportunity and he's run with it.
He's ordering our American heroes, the United States military, and forcing them to put on a vulgar display to celebrate his birthday, just as other failed dictators have done in the past. Look, this isn't just about protests here in Los Angeles. When Donald Trump sought blanket authority to commandeer the National Guard, he made that order apply to every state in this nation.
And some of this is personal with Donald Trump. Gavin Newsom's ex-wife is now a close ally of Trump's.
Yeah, the incoming ambassador to Greece. She was engaged also to Donald Trump Jr. It gives you a kind of sense of the incestuousness of American politics. She was a Fox News anchor, and she's became a MAGA loyalist. So there's this personal dynamic there as well.
He's sometimes described as almost too smooth, too confident, too slick. And yet in this moment, as you say, he seems to be playing it quite well. The dewy-eyed speech seems to have gone down quite well.
So on Monday, Gavin Newsom posted on X that Marines shouldn't be deployed on American soil facing their own countrymen to fulfill the deranged fancy of a dictatorial president. This is un-American.
It is a serious moment under the guise of immigration, but it's much deeper than that.
George, there's clearly a war of words happening around this, both between Donald Trump and Gavin Newsom. Is it more than that, though? I keep hearing from people in California that they genuinely think they could be heading towards a civil war.
Yeah, and actually Newsom himself kind of used that language recently. I think Democrats had long been predicting that Republicans' strategy was on immigration. Let's do these aggressive policies, maybe trigger a summer of unrest and crack down on it even harder and leave Democrats in the position of defending these protesters. I think there's a phrase that Stephen Miller, who's a kind of senior aide in the White House, has used. It's an 80-20 issue. So 80% of the public are going to side with the US government and with Trump over the 20% who are going to think that, oh no, it's constitutionally questionable and it raises legal questions. They're betting that most people don't care about that and that they're going to be kind of so enraged by these images that they're going to back Trump eventually. So it does put the Democrats in a corner, but I would say for them, it is useful that a new figurehead has emerged. They seemed a little bit lost. They seemed on the back foot since the election defeat. I mean, obviously, they were looking for someone who was going to kind of be fighting the good fight, who was going to be resisting Trump. But in Newsom, they appear to have found someone.
Given that there are personal interests on both sides to keep this going, is there any incentive for either Donald Trump or for Gavin Newsom to actually dial down the rhetoric to try and contain the situation?
You know, you could see how an unforced error could quickly lead to a real problem for either. So for Trump, if he deployed the Marines, if they mistakenly, pull the trigger or deliberately pull the trigger and fired a live round and they killed someone, and I'm just thinking about the optics of it, which way do the sympathies of Americans go? It could suddenly start to cause a bit of a problem for him. But at the moment, they're both doing pretty well out of this ding-dong.
Donald Trump does seem to have really upped the ante by not only sending in the National Guard, but also the Marines. Is it quite hard as a man who hasn't always been against protests?
Well, he's a man who defies political logic. I don't think he really cares if it might look a bit hypocritical to other people that, on the one hand, there's the history of January the 6th and on the other hand, there's what's going on in LA and he's condemning one forward protest and celebrating other.
Do you think he has a plan here, or is this just impulsive behaviour?
I think he saw an opportunity. I think they thought this might trigger something, the aggressive tactics that ICE, the Immigration's Customs Enforcement officers, were using. But for it to happen in California with Gavin Newsom and Los Angeles and people waving Mexican flags, he will think he has capitalized on a political opportunity.
And just finally, George, LA is no stranger as a city to riots and protests. It has a long history of them. Black Lives Matter more recently. If you go back to 1992, you had the Rodney King riots after it's a similar incident, really, and all the way back to 1965 with the Watts riots too. Is this likely to become another sort of iconic flashpoint in Californian history?
I think it's interesting the way in which ethnic tensions in the US have moved. If you look back at those previous riots, it tends to be about the treatment of African Americans by white law enforcement. And this is a kind of confrontation between the Hispanic communities in particular and predominantly white law enforcement. That's a change, I would say. I can't think of any kind of protests or riots or violence in US cities that have come from that particular tension. I think the Republicans see an opportunity that if there is a summer of unrest and we've started to see protests spread to other kind of famously liberal cities, this is going to play to their base, really, and it's going to appeal to swing voters, they believe. If there's this kind of these images of cities up in flames, and then you have Democratic politicians kind of defending the right of protesters, I think Trump and the Republicans in the party think they're in a pretty good place ahead of the midterms.
That was the Times Washington correspondent George Grylls, and we also heard from our reporter in Los Angeles, Samuel Lovett. You can find all the latest coverage on the protests and their political fallout online at thetimes.com. The producer today was Shabnam Gurrawal. The executive producer was Molly Guinness. And sound design and theme composition were by Mal Assetto. If you want to get in touch with us about anything you've heard on this episode, or if you have any ideas for future ones, do drop us a line to thestory@thetimes.com. And if you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. See you again soon.